All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome back from Thanksgiving weekend, the long weekend. I think we should have three-day weekends all the time. What do you think? Yeah? Yeah? Me too, I think. I think these 5-day work weeks, ridiculous. Maybe eventually. But for now, we're stuck with 5 days, right? Anyone do anything fun? Slept, ate, slept again, ate some more. That's it. It was pretty wet though, actually, this weekend. So, okay, let's see who's here. Ayushi is here. Good morning to you, Ayushi. And Michaela's here. Good morning, Michaela. And Ananda's here. Good morning to you. And John is here. Good morning, John. And Shania's here. Hello, Shania. And Rafin is here. Good morning to you. And Hadil is here. Good morning, Hadil. Okay, so let's jump in. Does anyone remember what we were talking about on Friday? It seems so long ago. There was like a war brewing, and there was a guy with a funny mustache, and he was being kind of a jerk. What's that?
We're looking at propaganda.
Yeah, we were looking at propaganda. You remember more than I do, apparently. We were looking at, so we had talked a lot about Adolf Hitler and his rise to power and who he is and how he kind of maneuvers himself into the office of Chancellor. We talked a little bit about Nazi propaganda and how it's used and some of the symbols and so on. And then we talked just briefly on Friday about the Spanish Civil War. And I said I didn't want us to spend a whole ton of time on it because as that pretty intense 10-minute video showed us, there's a lot of names, there's a lot of events. It's a pretty complicated civil war, right? And so maybe all we need to know for our own purposes here is that, you know, the Spanish Civil War occurs during a transition between kind of an absolute monarchy and sort of a democratic monarchy, a constitutional monarchy, right? But people disagree on exactly how they want that transition to happen and kind of what the country should look like in terms of how sort of liberal and how democratic it should be. And so the two sides start fighting, a war breaks out, and eventually we have two sides kind of coalesce or kind of clump together, right? And so we have these kind of nationalists or fascists fighting with alongside Catholics and monarchists. Then on the other side we have we have Republicans, we have people who are interested in democracy, fighting alongside with communists and anarchists, and so it's kind of a weird collection of it's strange bedfellows, as they say. There's a strange collection of people fighting on both sides. Goes on for a few years, and then finally, who's going to win? Yeah, Francisco Franco is going to win, the sort of nationalist leader. He's able to kind of get everybody on one side and sort of and is able to sort of conquer the left, if you will, who's kind of disorganized and can't really agree on things. You can imagine, you know, if you've got a bunch of people who are pro-democracy and pro-communism on the same team, they're going to have some disagreements about things. And so for them, the war doesn't really work out, but Spain will remain kind of a fascist dictatorship all the way through until the 1970s, surprisingly enough. But what was for our kind of purposes here, what was the significance of the Spanish Civil War? Like, why do we care about it? Because it's part of history. True. Technically, everything is part of history, but it's true. Good morning.
And it was kind of like a training ground for everyone. This whole yard, everyone would just knock their heads together as he was training, except for the French and the British.
Right. So there's these two sides in Spain who are fighting it out, and other countries use this as an opportunity to kind of test things out, a little bit of a training ground where they can, you know, sort of fight, but in a smaller sandbox, if you will. And so, as you mentioned, the French and the British sit this one out, right? Their militaries are not very large, and their public is not very interested in going to war at this point. But the Germans and the Italians and the Soviets are only too happy to participate, right? For the Italians and for the Germans, it's a chance for them to kind of get their feet wet and get ready for a war that is clearly coming. For the Soviets, it's more of an attempt, and we'll get to this with the Soviet Union later, but the Soviets are trying to support communist groups abroad so that they can have their own communist revolution. And so the Soviet Union's kind of got its, hands in a lot of countries, sort of funneling them money, trying to get them to have a communist revolution of their own. And so the communists are there kind of backing up the sort of left side here. So yeah, it's a bit of a testing ground. And yeah, again, Britain and France kind of sit this one out, right? So the Nazis get to stretch their war muscles, as do the Italians, but France and Britain are going to sit this one out. But not for long, right? They're going to be called into action very, very shortly. So we had a bit of a timeline here that I showed you, and we've talked about, or at least seen these things happen in documentary, right? We saw Germany occupy the Rhineland in 1936. What got done about that? Nothing. Nobody. No slap on the wrist. No slap anywhere. They just let him do it, right? 1938, he merges with Austria. That is illegal according to the Treaty of Versailles. What happens as a result of that? Nothing happens. All quiet. He takes the Sudetenland, right? That piece of Czechoslovakia. What happens?
The dude from Britain comes down and tells, okay, you guys.
Yeah. So there's a peace conference. I think France, the president of France is there as well. They have a little summit meeting. They agree that Hitler says, oh, and now that I have the Sudetenland, everything is fine. Let's make peace. The German people desire peace, right? So he kind of puts on this front. He makes an agreement with them. Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, says it's peace in our time, and everyone pats themselves on the back for a job well done and goes home, right? But of course, it ain't over, right? Because very shortly after that, he takes the rest of Czechoslovakia. Oops. And then finally he invades Poland, right? And this is the last straw for the Allies, right? They know that he's not going to settle down. They know he's not going to go away. They've made a peace treaty with him that he, tore up as soon as it happened. And so clearly this guy cannot be negotiated with, and they choose to go to war.
They also, the Polish had a little treaty with the French and the British that they would say that they would back them up in case of a German assault, only a German. They don't care about anything else.
Right, which was, what did they say in the textbook about that? Because yeah, the British and the French had promised to defend Poland against a German attack.
They did nothing.
Yeah.
They just waited.
Yeah, it was kind of like a show of support, right? It was all words. It wasn't really, they weren't going to rush to defend Poland, although Poland does kind of get them into the war, but still too late for Poland, right? Because by the time Britain and France declare war, Poland doesn't really exist anymore, right? So, what's that? No? As an autonomous state, Poland does not exist. Yeah. So Britain and France declare war, just because we're in Canada. Canada declares war as well, but a week later than Great Britain. In World War I, we didn't talk about this very much, but Canada got pulled into the war because it still had a colonial relationship with Great Britain. We didn't really have any foreign policy of our own, so when Britain declared war, we were automatically in World War I, whether we liked it or not. This time, we don't really have time to go into it, but a number of things had happened. Canada was a little more independent, so we purposely waited a week just so we could show that we were doing it on our own. We were making our own choice. We weren't just jumping in because Britain jumped in. We were going to make our own choice. So,
But isn't Canada pledged to Britain?
are we what?
Like you pledged to Britain that they'll back them up?
Well, I think we probably were allied with them. I mean, we still had a close relationship with them. And I don't think it was, and actually, if you want to talk about this for a minute, at the beginning of World War II, there was a little more opposition to World War II than there was to World War I in Canada. So like I said, in Canada, in World War I, nobody really knew what they were getting into. Thousands of young men sign up to go and fight for glory. Of course, it's not very glorious, as we know, but they don't know any better, and so they sign up. Recruits for the Second World War are a little slower coming in because of that. But also there's a bit of a divide in Canada because a huge percentage of Canada at that time is British. And so they do feel an allegiance to Britain. And so when Britain gets involved in World War II, most Canadians are of kind of English heritage, and they're like, we've got to get over there and back up the Queen, right? All for God and country and all that sort of stuff, right? So a lot of people feel that way, except people in Quebec. So Quebec is predominantly French at this point, and so the French have the opposite view. They're like, this is a European war. This has nothing to do with us. Why are we getting involved? And so the French in Quebec had kind of severed their ties with France hundreds of years before. And so the French in Quebec really see themselves as kind of a distinct group. And so while, pardon me, while all of English Canada was like, yes, we've got to back up Britain, the French in Quebec were thinking, no, this isn't really our fight, it's not our war, let's stay out of it. So there was a little bit of a divide in Canada over that, and actually it gets worse in Canada as conscription is introduced. You know what conscription is? What's conscription? Right, when you're legally required military service. So at the beginning of World War II, we don't have it, it's all voluntary. But as more and more people start to die, as the war drags on, the government wants to introduce conscription. And that becomes a further divide because, again, the French in Quebec feel, no, we don't want to be forced to participate in this war that we didn't want to go to in the first place. And so that becomes an even wider divide. And so actually by the end of World War II in Canada, there's a big distance, there's a big gap between French Canada and English Canada because of that reason. And so
One more question. The current monarch of Canada, isn't it the Queen of England?
she is, well, in a way. So our political system is modeled on the British one. And so in the British one, the Queen is the head of state, right? And so once upon a time, that was the same thing for Canada as well. But as we've kind of become more independent, we don't really look to the Queen for these things. And so for the country, we have a Governor General. And so you may have heard of her in the news, Julie Payette. There was some scandals about her in terms of a toxic working environment, or that she's difficult to work with or something. There's a bit of a scandal thing going on around that. But we have a Governor General, and the Governor General stands in for the Queen. And so he or she performs the very limited role in the Canadian government system that the Queen would perform. And so the Queen is technically our head of state.
Which is just this lady you just mentioned. She's basically the regent. Like,
She's a symbol. She has no power. She doesn't do anything over here. She's very busy. She has 9 dogs. She can't pay attention to Canada. So we have a Governor General, and the Governor General, as I say, performs basically the major function of the Governor General is that they can dissolve Parliament and call an election. So if, let's say, Justin Trudeau, he didn't call an election for this fall, but he could have. Some people were wondering if he would. And if he wanted to, he would have to go to the Governor General, Julie Payette, and say, look, I think the conditions warrant that we need an election. Will you please dissolve Parliament so we can have an election? And that's, the Governor General has the power to do that. They can also say no, but this is another long story too. But usually the Governor General doesn't involve themselves in Canadian politics, and so if the Prime Minister asks for it, they grant it.
It's the same as the Queen. She's literally the same as the Queen. Does nothing.
She has one very important function, and actually, okay, I'm going to tell you the story, if I remember it correctly. So there was, one of our prime ministers was William Lyon Mackenzie King, okay? And so he'd been Prime Minister of Canada for, he's actually been our longest serving Prime Minister, kind of, and we may hear about him a little bit later because he shows up in the 1940s. His government was accused of a scandal, okay? So it was his customs officers were being bribed to let stuff over the border or something like that. Big scandal. And so William Lyon Mackenzie King, as Prime Minister, was worried that his party would be investigated by like an ethics commissioner. They would find out that they were, taking bribes, and it would all blow up in his face. So what he decided to do is try to call an election. Okay, so he was going to try to dodge the investigation by dissolving Parliament and calling an election. So he went to the Governor General, who was Lord Byng, who I think the school in Vancouver is named after, I think. Byng, yeah. So he goes to Lord Byng and he says, look, I think we need to have an election. Will you call one? And Lord Byng, the Governor General, says no. And so he says, I'm not calling an election. So what happens? I think what he does is that William Lyon Mackenzie King steps down. I might get the details wrong here. It's been a long time since I read it. He steps down. Lord Byng asks if there is any other party that thinks they can form government, which he can do. The Conservatives step up, and I think it's Robert Borden, but don't quote me on that. He stands up and says, yes, I think our Conservatives can form a government. Very well, go ahead. So they set themselves up. They try to pass a throne speech, which Justin Trudeau just did, and the government collapses. So there's a non-confidence vote, so everybody stands up and says we have no confidence in this party. The government collapses, an election is triggered anyway. They go to the polls, William Lyon Mackenzie King gets elected again and becomes Prime Minister. And so the whole thing gets called, because it's William Mackenzie, or William Lyon Mackenzie King is the Prime Minister. The whole thing gets called the King Byng Wingding, or the King Byng thing, where it's this whole thing, and eventually William Lyon Mackenzie King becomes Prime Minister again, and he does manage to dodge the corruption charge. But again, that was kind of the last time where the Governor General interfered in Canadian politics, and so now usually if the Prime Minister asks for an election, they get one. The Governor General usually doesn't stand in the way of it. But I think that happened in the early 1950s, and it was this whole thing, and eventually it just got back to the way it was with William Lyon Mackenzie King as Prime Minister. But anyway, yeah, so the Governor General has a very limited job. If anyone ever wants to appoint you as Governor General, sweet gig. You don't have that much to do. So Amanda, if anyone ever appoints you Governor General, I would take it. Unless you have other political aspirations, but it's not a bad job.
Can the Governor General call a vote without a Prime Minister asking?
No. Well, I think maybe in a very strange case they could. Like if things just weren't functioning in any way, the Governor General could trigger one. But usually what would happen is it would be a confidence vote. So whoever the party was in charge, things wouldn't be going well, it would be chaotic. somebody would stand up and say, I vote no confidence in this government. And if it passes, if they get a majority on that motion, then government collapses and an election is triggered. So again, everyone in Parliament kind of always has their finger on the self-destruct button. And so if Justin Trudeau loses his mind and his Liberals start doing crazy things, basically everyone can stand up and say, we have no confidence. They can hold a vote, and then again, the government collapses and an election is triggered. But it's actually not a bad system, to be honest. It doesn't happen very often. Weird things like the King Bing thing don't happen very often, but sometimes they do, and they're very exciting.
I know we got all sidetracked, but one question. When the government collapses until the new prime minister is elected, who rules?
Say again?
So they vote non confidence, the government collapses, they have to hold an election.
Yes.
So in that time period, who governs the country?
So the party who's in power still continues to govern until the election results come in. So we're not. So I said the government collapses, but that's kind of a figurative term. Yeah. So in that case, William Lyon Mackenzie King stepped down. But if we had an election, so if an election was triggered in Canada today, Justin Trudeau would remain prime minister until the outcome of that election. Because you need somebody governing, right? Okay, that was a bit of a tangent, but any other questions about that? No, we actually don't have a bad system in Canada. I think there's lots of fail safes where, no government can really get too far out of control without somebody pulling the plug on them. Okay, so in September 1939, Germany invades Poland, as does the Soviet Union. Probably a certain degree of panic ensues in France and Britain as they realize that they've got probably another war on their hands, and maybe even a war with two belligerents, not just one, right? Because the Soviet Union was, I'm not sure if it was on their radar about what Joseph Stalin was doing over there, but suddenly we have two unfriendly, hostile nations mobilizing in Europe, and stuff gets real, right? I had asked you to read this section of the textbook on Friday, and I don't think we got all the way through it because it was kind of a bit of a long section. Can I give you 10 minutes just to sort of read over and finish the questions? Would that be okay? Okay. So I'll put 10 minutes on the clock here. I'll let you read and sort of refresh your memory, and then we'll talk about these, okay? Okay, ready, shreddies? Yeah, talk about a few of these. All right, so I think we talked about this on Friday, but what Soviet action caused concern among the Western nations in 1939? Was it the invasion of Poland or was it the Finns? I think it was the invasion of Poland. Yeah, and so why was that so concerning to the Allies? Stalin becoming more powerful, yep, he certainly was, and we'll talk about that when we get to the Soviet Union. What else? Why was it so concerning?
So I don't know if it's mentioned or not, but the Germans and the Soviets had an agreement, the non-aggression pact, which meant those were basically friends. So they had to deal with the Germans, and all the Germans were too much for them.
Right. And so, yeah, so the German or the British and the French saw the Germans that were arming themselves. They were getting stronger and stronger. They were becoming more and more aggressive, and everybody's getting a little worried about Nazi Germany and, oh gosh, is there going to be a war? What's going to happen? And then all of a sudden, here comes the Soviet Union, right, invading Poland. And so, you know, you can probably imagine a little bit of panic on the part of France and Britain, like, oh shoot, right? We thought we had one problem. Now, do we have two? How's this going to go, right? Are these guys allied somehow? And I mean, as you mentioned, they did have a non-aggression pact, so they agreed not to attack each other. They're not necessarily allied, but we know that's going to, yeah. But yeah, so again, suddenly the Soviet Union is becoming aggressive as well, right? And so Britain and France are worried about, oh gosh, we thought we had one enemy. Now do we have two? Eek, right? Eek. The initial phase of the Second World War was called the Phony War. Why was it called the Phony War? Yeah. So when does war get declared by Britain and France? 1939. What month? Yeah, so September 1939, and then the first real fighting doesn't happen until probably May of 1940, right? So that's a long time where very little happens. What does it mean when something's phony? Is what? It's fake, right? It's phony news. Yeah, it's kind of an old slang. Nobody uses phony anymore so much, but yeah, it means fake, not real, right? So it's a phony war because there's really no fighting going on. But of course, we know that more fighting will occur. For the last question, Ayushi said also because they were on opposite sides in the last war and suddenly they were allies, so it was very concerning. Yeah, it definitely would have been concerning, right? Because the Soviet Union and France and Britain were certainly not friends this time out, right? Last time in World War I, they were allied. Russia was allied with France and Britain. This time, not so much, right? And so I think, I'm not really sure what the British and French knew at the moment, but it probably appeared that they at least weren't enemies, right? And how allied they were, maybe nobody knew, which was probably terrifying as well, right? Yeah.
Did the French invasion of Germany happen before or after, like, in the period that is called the Phony War, or did it happen before?
The German invasion of France?
The French invasion of Germany, because they did invade a small part of Germany.
Oh, right. Right. I think that offensive might be what sort of kicks off the real part of the fighting, I think, is that initial exchange, I think. Yeah, that I'd have to confirm, but I think that's what kicks it off. Yeah, because as we know, the fighting will begin in, I think, May of 1940, and by about June of 1940, what's going to happen to France? What's that? Yeah, France is going to be France is going to tap out pretty much immediately, right? And so we said that they had built that Maginot Line, all those complicated fortifications with guns and underground passageways and storage facilities and all kinds of things. But they left a gap in it, right? Because there were trees. And they figured that the tanks wouldn't go through the trees. But whoops, the tanks did, right? And so the Maginot Line, billions of dollars spent, pointless, as the Germans just go around. They roll right into Paris. They force the French to surrender, which they do. And then that's kind of it for France, right? How is France kind of run after the Nazi invasion? I think that's the next, that's the next question. Explain the partition of France and how is each section administered? Yep.
And what remains was to be governed from, I think, a place called Vichy, so the name that's where the name Vichy France came from.
Right.
And then after some point, the Germans take control of the rest of France just to make sure that no invasion was coming there.
Right. So the French roll in. The Germans roll in, right? They force the French to surrender, and the Nazis take control of kind of the northern part of France and the part along the kind of the Mediterranean and the Atlantic. Why would they do that?
Well, at first they don't take over the Mediterranean. They leave it to the Vichy.
Yeah.
They take over the Atlantic part.
Yes.
To defend it against possible landings.
To defend against possible landings, yeah. Because that's exactly where the British will come from, right? If the British are going to come into France, they're going to come from the sea, which of course eventually they do. So the Germans decide that they're going to take the northern part of France and just leave the southern part of France to this Vichy government, right? Which is the remains of the French government ruling from Vichy. But are they really in charge, this Vichy government? Hello, are they in charge? Yes, no, maybe so? Aliana, are they in charge, the Vichy government, really? Huh? No, why not? Adel, who is in charge? Who's calling the shots on this Vichy government? No? Ashley, help me out here. Who's telling this Vichy government what to do? Okay, Rose, it's all yours. Who's telling the Vichy government in France what to do? Who's giving them their orders? Huh? Who? Yes, the Germans are giving them their orders, right? So the Nazis are ruling in the northern part of France, and they're basically telling the Vichy government in the south what to do, right? And so what do they tell the Vichy government to do? There's a few things. They tell them to hand over a bunch of people to Germany, right? Who gets handed over? Yeah, a bunch of French Jewish people get sent out of France back into Nazi-controlled Europe, which is going to be bad news for them, as you might imagine. Who else gets sent back into Germany? Yeah, maybe some undesirables too. But who else did they mention? They mentioned like 640,000. I don't know. They might be from the army, but what are they sent back to Germany to do? Yeah, skilled laborers, right? So Germany needs people to work, and so They basically they borrow them from France, right? And so, yeah, so Michaelis's workers, yeah, so they send these workers back to Germany to work there. Yes. What's that? Um, yeah, if there's anyone who's in opposition to the Germans, they probably get sent to a camp as well. What about reparations? What happens there?
So the French are supposed to pay a whole lot of money again. Also, they have to pay for the German, the occupiers. They have to pay so that they will stay there.
Yeah, so the Germans set reparations to the French, about 300 million francs a day, to pay for them occupying their country. Right? Do you think they're still bitter about the Treaty of Versailles? Yeah, I think so. It sounds like they're not over it. Sounds like they're not over it. So yeah, things go bad for France very, very quickly, right? And they are out of the fight almost immediately. How do you think Britain feels about this? Freaked out. Why would you be freaked out? Why?
What can I do against them right now? They got my friend. They just kicked him out and threw him away.
Like they were the only ones winning against Germany.
Yeah, their one friend, their one ally in Europe has tapped out, is out of the fight, like 2 weeks into the thing, right? Like no fighting happens for almost a year, and then the fighting happens in May, and then in June, the French are out. Panic, right? Now Britain is all alone against this Nazi war machine that is plowing across the continent, taking over everything in its path. Scary, right? I'd feel a little scared, I think. So what happens here during the Battle of Britain? The Battle of Britain. The Battle of Britain.
So the plan for the Battle of Britain was that the German Navy would secure like first the Luftwaffe would blow up the air bases, and then the German Navy would occupy those ends of the English Channel.
Mm-hmm.
The rest of the Navy would ferry out 190,000 troops across to Britain and supply them, which the Navy wasn't quite like scared of it.
Yeah, so
They knew they couldn't do it. They just didn't have enough. The Luftwaffe did.
yeah.
All for it. So
Yeah, so there's this plan called Operation Sea Lion, which sounds pretty cool. Operation Sea Lion, right, which is the plan for Nazi Germany to invade Britain, right? But of course, unfortunately for Germany and fortunately for Britain, Britain controls the English Channel. They have a massive navy, right? So there's no clear way across for the Germans. Also, the Germans don't really have the ships to transport their troops to Britain anyway, right? So there's this plan, but the plan has a few minor flaws in it, right? So it's basically not workable. And so the Luftwaffe, the Air Force, the German Air Force, starts bombing British fighter bases. That doesn't seem to work. And eventually it turns into a full-scale bombing of British cities and towns, right? So the Nazis are actually bombing the city of London itself.
yeah, they said something about that, saying that one misguided bomber blew up a bit of London. The Brits retaliated. They blew up Berlin.
Yeah.
Hitler got pissed off, so we told him, okay, just command the city.
And then it's on, right? So yeah, it kind of happens a little bit accidentally, right? But before you know it, the Germans are bombing actually the city of London, right? So again, these aren't military targets, these aren't industrial targets, these are just regular people living in London that are facing German bombs, right? So yeah, everybody at the time had bomb shelters. There were these sirens that would go off if there was a radar. If the radar picked up incoming German bombers, you'd hear this siren thing. And yeah, like that would be your cue to get underground because your city was about to be bombed by the Luftwaffe. So pretty intense period, right? Especially for people who are not part of the war, right? This is just regular people trying to go about their daily life, right? Did you like my siren sound? Was that good? Yeah.
Not annoying at all.
What's that?
It wasn't annoying at all.
It wasn't doing it?
It isn't annoying at all.
It wasn't annoying? Oh, okay, I'll try again later. I think that's kind of what it sounded like, though. Oh, I was close. Fine, I don't have a good World War II air raid siren impression. Fine.
I don't really have it because when my dad calls, that phone goes off.
What's that?
When my dad calls, that sound goes off.
That's your ringtone?
For my dad, yeah.
Can you play it for us? Or you can ask your dad to call you.
Okay, he's the one that's called. New phone. So.
Okay, I'll find a clip of it later and we can compare. But anyway, do you want to take a little break while I find that? Okay, let's take 10. We'll come back. We'll talk about some of these things. See.
Yep, I got it.
You got it? What's yours sound like?
Hi,
Hey, good morning. How's it going?
you only have 3 students?
4, 5, 6. I have 6.
All good?
Yeah.
And for a second there, I thought it was coming from outside.
We don't have a basement in this building, so
Stairways,
maybe. We have the parkade.
maybe? Or they were supposed to stand an earthquake.
It's kind of creepy, actually.
It's supposed to be creepy.
I know.
You know, I played this sound, and my mom was in the next room, and she heard it, and she freaked out, and suddenly she was like, "Is that you?" Yeah. She wanted to kill me. She actually lived through the war,
Hmm.
and then they ran her off board. And so she said that we were just going to bed. The day after was supposed to be the first day of school, and all of a sudden, boom! Dead in the night, you just come out and see bombers are flying over the city and just bombing the whole city off the hill.
Holy cow. Yeah, I could see why she wouldn't be eager to hear that sound. Holy smokes.
Well, it's actually a bad war. It was like World War I all over. There were trenches, there were chemical weapons, there were
Yeah.
people rushing the trenches.
And that was, what year was that?
1988 to 88. 88 ended, but 1980 started.
Yeah. Hmm.
That was like 2 years after the revolution.
Yeah, because that was 79, right? 78? Yeah, that's not so long ago. Were they in Tehran or?
No, they were in Awadan. The city, so there was a city called Khorramshahr and a city called Awadan. They were like real close. It was like 5 minutes driving from this city to that.
Mm-hmm.
So the one called Khorramshahr was annihilated. It was just leveled with the ground. Nothing was left of it, and the other one was besieged for some time. My dad, I think, was in the city while it was besieged. My mom wasn't living there. Then the siege was broken, and the war turned. Yeah, we started invading parts of Iraq. Then they pushed us back. Then we pretty much just ended up in a stalemate. We had a larger military, we had a larger population, 3 to 1 the ratio was, but we just got out of a revolution, so we just had a lot of purge and lost a whole ton of officers. And they had a lot of officers, so they kind of canceled each other out.
Mm.
And it was a stalemate and just a lot of bombings and shootings. They fired missiles, hit Tehran with them. They
What-
retaliated, shot Baghdad with missiles.
What was the sort of catalyst for this war? Like, why did it start?
So actually it just started overnight. No reason, they just bombed us.
Hmm.
It was about, well, Saddam Hussein was kind of like, dictator and whatever. And our new government was not supposed to be a dictatorship. So they were kind of conflict ideologies. And
Mm.
yeah, so they decided, yeah, we don't really want them.
Was prior to the revolution, was there an alliance between Iran and Iraq?
No, prior to the revolution, there were some conflicts, but then it was the Shah was in control, and
Yeah.
the military had all of its officers, and it was a pretty tough one. You couldn't have possibly messed with them.
Oh.
Yeah, they
So
actually,
Iraq thought it was like a period of weakness that they could.
it was a kind of period of weakness, yes, because there were a lot of purges going on,
Yeah.
and the fight was over a river called Chateau. It's where the Euphrates and the Tigris merge.
Mm-hmm.
It was like the border was there. Half of this waterway was ours and the other half was theirs. Saddam Hussein didn't want this. There was a treaty signed between the both countries in, I don't know what you call that country.
What?
So it was a country like that, an Arabic country. Anyways, yeah, they signed a treaty there.
Okay.
Saying that end the war, this half is theirs, this half is yours, just stop it. So they stopped it, and then the province they were going to occupy, Kurdistan province, my home province, it's just oil all over. So you can imagine why. Yeah, there was a bit of a weakness in the military, obviously,
Mhm.
and then they attacked. And things got nasty. And also that waterway was the only way for Iraq into the Gulf.
Right.
They started hitting civilians, tankers, even like oil tanker has like, I don't know, flag of say India.
Boom.
Blow it up.
Wow. That's not good for business.
Then they ended that war and they attacked Kuwait. Then the US came.
Right. That part I remember, because of course, in the Western media they don't report the Iran-Iraq war very well. The Kuwait war they did.
They were actually kind of backing up Saddam, the whole Western world,
Yeah. Until he took something that they wanted or wanted access to.
He got a bit too.
What's that?
He got a bit too cocky. I got the toughest military in the region.
Mm-hmm. Not anymore.
Now we can try.
Now what?
Now we can try. They're kind of our mini colony. And we're the Russians.
Yeah, what is the situation in Iraq currently? You don't hear much about it, like in the Western media, you don't hear much about it now
We don't hear
since ISIS.
we don't hear all that much about it. The infrastructure is like ruins.
I guess it's not surprising, right? They had a dictator who probably didn't care about the people for a few decades, and then they go through a pretty destructive war, and then the U.S. just kind of leaves them high and dry, and then you've got an Islamic State floating around in there, and they're no picnic either, and
They were actually kind of like early in the year, like around January. They freaked out, thinking that there was a war going to break out between the States and us, and that they would have been the main theater.
yeah, I don't know. I don't think.
Because the U.S., based on the geography of the country, they can't really land anywhere. Wherever they land, they're going to
Yeah.
face a whole lot of mountains, and no one wants to land behind mountains.
No, and really their only clear ally in that area is Israel, and that's a long
That's
a long way.
Yeah, they're in our missile range.
Yeah, I remember. Was that a year ago or a few months ago?
The assassination?
Well, yeah, things were getting tense, right? There was, like there was embargoes on ships, and there was some threatening stuff happening, was it in Persian Gulf or some of that stuff? Yeah, and so I know there was posturing.
Yeah, we didn't have anything to do with those ships. It was real funny. I usually don't back up my own government because I know what freaks they are. But at this one, yeah, it wasn't us.
Well, and the guy in the White House is not the coolest head around either, so I don't know. Okay, and we're back. The air raid siren that I was trying to imitate a few minutes ago actually sounds like this. Hopefully not. I don't know. Sounds kind of spooky anyway, but that's what you would hear at the time, right, in London. And so if you heard it, that was definitely your cue to get below ground, right, because you were about to be bombed.
I've seen photos of
Of the sirens?
the people who wanted to, like, the subways in Paris.
Yeah.
They were literally lounging in the subways. I don't know if grandmas were doing this thing. What do you call it?
Knitting, yeah.
They were doing this thing.
Well, I think it became a very, regular occurrence, right? It wasn't just once. It was like nightly or a few nights a week. And so people, were probably stressed by it, but also got used to the occurrence of.
They probably had it on their calendar. Air raid break.
Well, somebody had it on their calendar. Okay, so of course the Soviet Union getting involved in Poland was frightening for the Allies because, of course, now do we have two opponents or one? Hey, Aliana, are you with me there? The Phony War, of course, was phony because no fighting really happened. Again, there was fighting that happened, but really not a lot, and certainly none that involved the Allies, right? So there was still stuff going on in Poland. There was still stuff going on in kind of Finland, but for the most part, greater war had not broken out, right? We said that the Germans roll into France in 1940 very quickly, and they force the French to surrender the next month, right? And there was that evacuation at Dunkirk, which of course rescued a lot of Allied soldiers and allowed them to fight another day. Also made for a nifty Christopher Nolan movie if you're into that kind of thing. And again, France was partitioned, with the north part being directly controlled by the Nazis and the south part being controlled by the Vichy government, but the Vichy government was taking their orders from the Nazis, right? So they were paying huge amounts of reparations. They were sending Jewish people and sort of skilled workers back to Germany in order to accomplish German goals. And so, yeah, the French government at this point is an instrument of the Nazis, unfortunately. Yeah, and so the Battle of Britain is what they call this sort of pretty systematic bombing of Britain by the Nazis, right? And so there was that Operation Sea Lion that we talked about, that Hitler wanted to invade Britain, but wasn't really feasible, right? They didn't have control of the English Channel. They didn't have the transport ships to bring their troops across anyway, so not a workable plan, right? So instead, they start bombing these fighter bases. Eventually, that leads to the bombing of London itself. And as you can see, a lot of people are killed in this, right? And again, these are just regular people trying to go about their daily lives, and they're gonna get bombed, right? If you've ever seen this, or some version of this, because it's a meme now, and there's about 1 million things. Keep calm and, eat avocado toast or whatever they're talking about now. There's always a keep calm and something, right? But this is actually a World War II poster. And so these were posted around Britain, kind of asking people or persuading people or encouraging people to keep calm and carry on. Yes, we know we're being bombed. Yes, it's terrifying, but they were asking British citizens to just not freak out about it and just try to continue to go about their daily lives, right? So that's where this poster originally comes from World War II, from the Blitz. Keep calm and carry on, right? Yes, we're being bombed, but try to live your life normally anyway, if you can. So by 1940, by about mid-1940, things don't look so good for the Allies, right? This is Europe, and of course the red part is controlled by Nazi Germany, right? We have Italy down there that is actually allied with Nazi Germany, so that's not good either. And we have Russia, which should be the Soviet Union, actually. We have the Soviet Union over there, and we're not really sure about what their intentions are either. We're not sure if we're the British, we're not sure if they are friend or foe, right? So again, if you're sitting there in England and you're looking at the map of Europe, it's not a pretty picture, right? So most of Western Europe has fallen to the Nazis, and you don't really have any clear friends in this fight, right? Everyone's been taken over or has decided to remain neutral in this conflict, right? So I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. That brings us to this gentleman here. And so this is Winston Churchill. Who's heard of Winston Churchill before? Yeah, good stuff. So he's going to be Prime Minister of Great Britain for most of World War II. He's not Prime Minister when the war starts. I think that's still Neville Chamberlain. But he is, he's going to be made Prime Minister in, as you can see, in 1940. And so Neville Chamberlain kind of has a reputation as a bit of a wet noodle. He's a little soft. And again, when you're living in a country and when the going gets tough, people want to elect the tough guy. And Neville Chamberlain was not the tough guy. Churchill was, right? He was the one who, he had been sort of trying to sound the alarm about the Nazis for a long time. He had been, as far as I'm aware, he had been against appeasing Hitler from the very beginning. Of course, nobody listened to him at the time. But now it turned out that he was right. Hitler was a problem, and he had been the tough, strong voice all the way through this. And so he's the guy that gets picked when things don't look very good for Britain. And as we saw in the map before, things don't look very good at all, right? So he's going to be Prime Minister. We'll hear a little more about him later. He's a very quotable kind of guy, good public speaker, and so there's lots of Churchill quotes out there that are pretty decent. But I wanted to use this opportunity. What's that?
That's Churchill. That was supposed to be this.
Oh, he always did the The backwards V.
Means something not good thinking want your prime minister to do on the media, but
Maybe he did. I wanted to take this opportunity to talk again about primary sources, right? Because again, primary sources are what history is built on, right? That's how we know what happened in the first place. But again, we have to take them with a bit of a grain of salt, right? We have to think about who's speaking, why they're speaking, and who they're speaking to, because that's going to inform us about what is said, right? And so I have a primary source for you to read, and it's a speech that Winston Churchill gives. And so the occasion is he's been invited to a boys' school. So you can imagine him speaking to maybe a graduating class of, I don't know, 15 or 16-year-olds, if you will. You can imagine him speaking to these young boys, but there's a microphone in front of him, and so you can also imagine him probably speaking to the nation as well over radio. So he's speaking to these boys directly, but he's also speaking to all of England indirectly, okay? So I would like you to read this speech. It's not that long. Read this speech, and then we'll talk about it, okay? Now, my Microsoft Teams is malfunctioning here. Just hang on. So it is in Microsoft Teams, and as usual, it's under Files. So it's in the History 12 channel. It's under Files. It's under Class Materials, and then it is called. Is that what it's called, or are you guessing?
I was guessing.
Okay, that's probably what it's called, but let me see. Oh yeah, you'll see it right there. It's called Churchill, Never Give In, Never, Never, Never. And so, yeah, it's not a long speech, but I'd like you to read it, and then we'll talk about these questions that are on the screen. Okay? So just take a few minutes and read over, and then we'll listen to it for reals. Right. Okay, just one more minute.
So Washington,
Hmm?
after we're done with Washington,
Yeah.
because I'm having a difficult.
You're having difficulty with.
I had to start it. It was off.
Okay.
So here I started. It takes some time. No stop. Okay. And then connect it, and then Microsoft Teams. Microsoft Teams is just being Microsoft Teams.
Oh, okay. It was being fussy. Okay. No problem.
The BCND.
Okay, so I'll tell you what. Let's, now that we've read it, before we answer the questions, let's just actually listen to it for real, okay? So online people, I just put a YouTube link to the speech where you can listen to it. So go listen to it. It's the same one you just read. We'll watch it, or we'll listen to it here, and then we'll come back and talk about it, okay? Say again?
Tougher maybe.
Tougher, yeah. So stern means like, to be stern is to be like serious, no nonsense, no monkeying around kind of thing. That's stern, right? So he doesn't want to say dark days. He wants to say, stern, serious. We've got to be focused. We've got to be serious, right? Okay. So a couple of pretty simple questions, I think, maybe. Who created this source and why? So who is speaking? Yeah, so when we talk about who created this source, obviously somebody recorded him, right? And somebody wrote down what he said. But this is Winston Churchill's words, right? The words right out of his mouth. And fortunately, the technology is around in the 1940s, and we can actually record him. So 80 years into the future, now we get to hear exactly what he said at that school, right?
So this was after the Battle of Britain.
Yes. So I think, is this May 1941? Is that what it says? Or no, it's October. It's October 29th, 1941. So yeah, the Blitz is over, but he's referring to that period in his speech, right? He says, when it looked very bad for us, and it looked like we were maybe finished. Yeah, that's kind of what he's talking about, right? So why is he speaking today? Yeah, well, save that for number 3, right? But so he's giving a speech at I think I said he's giving a speech at a school, and he's on the microphone, and I imagine that this would have been broadcast to the nation, right? So all British people could have listened to Churchill on the radio, which I assume they did. Yeah, so I think I've answered 1 and 2 already, which sometimes I do. But the most important one is number 3. So what is he trying to communicate to these readers? And that's where your point comes in. So what were you saying there, Ahmad?
Like you cheer them up, lift their spirits.
Yeah, so maybe one of his goals is to sort of cheer up these boys and lift their spirits, right? What else? Yeah, he's got this kind of message that it's not over yet, right? Things didn't look very good, but now they look better. What else? What else does he say that is important? What's that? Never give up, right? That's the kind of the title of the speech, or that's the title that people give to that speech, right, later on. Except when? Unless it's really difficult, right? Then give in. No. When does he say you should never give in except? Convictions of honor. What does that mean? Maybe. Never give in. Let me read the exact. Let me read his exact words here, because this is a situation where you might want to quote something, because his exact words are important, right? Never give in. Never, never, never. Never, never, never. Never, never in nothing, great or small, large or petty. Never give in except to convictions of honor and good sense.
So what's that, like when something is dishonorable, you don't give in to honor?
Yeah, I think that's what he means. Don't give in if you're going to wind up doing something dishonorable to yourself, and give in for what's the second part? Convictions of honor and well, what does he say there? Yes, he says, never give in except in convictions of honor and good sense.
Oh, right. When what you're saying is not making sense, then you give in.
Yeah, or if somebody, presents you with a good, reasonable argument, critical thinking. If somebody presents you with a reasonable argument, then give in, right? Say, you know what? You are right, right? But when should you not give in? Any other time, right? Especially when you're being bullied, right? Especially when the overwhelming might of the enemy is upon you, as what he says. Never give in, right? It's scary, it's difficult. We may not have been ready at the beginning, right? We may not have been perfectly prepared for the war, but we're not giving in, right? What else does he say? He says some other things about British people.
Does it say something about the traditions at all? Or about the white caps?
Yeah, he talks a little bit about traditions, right? The traditions of the school. So the school has school songs that all the boys sing, right? But also think about who's listening to this on the radio, right? Do the British people have traditions as well? Yeah. So it's interesting, right? Because this speech is really to the boys, right? He's talking to these boys, but he also knows that the entire country is listening, right? So he's talking to them, but can you see how he's actually talking to the nation as well? Right? He's talking about, our school songs, our traditions would have been gone, but he's also talking about, if the enemy would have won, then Britain would have been gone as well, right? Britain's traditions would have been gone. What else does he say? Other things. What else does he say? Why does he change darker to sterner? Why does he do that? Yeah. So, yeah, he no longer that. But yeah, why would he? He's not a songwriter, right? But why does he want to make that? Why does he want to make that change to the school song? Do you think? What? Motivation? Give me more than that. Motivation?
So that British people they attack wolves to motivate them that they can just win.
Yeah. So he wants to help motivate the British, right, and make them feel better about what's happening.
Yeah, they said it was propaganda, saying that the tough times are behind us and it's going to be easier.
Yeah, it's a bit of yeah, he's consoling the nation, right? He's trying to make sure that Britain is ready to keep fighting, right? He's trying to encourage them because that's, in part that's his role, right? So this is where the audience comes in. He's up there and he's speaking, and he's not speaking to his wife over dinner, right? He's not speaking to his cabinet ministers or his drinking buddies. He's speaking to the country, right? And especially in wartime, there are things that the country needs to hear, right? And this is one of them that, let's not look on the dark side, or not on the dark side, but let's not be pessimistic. Let's not say, oh, these are dark days for Britain. That sounds like ominous, right? It sounds like it's all over. And so he's saying, it's not dark. These are stern days, right? These are days that we have to be serious and focused, but we can win through, right? What does he say we have to do in order to conquer? We only have to do this to conquer. only have to do this to conquer people. Yeah, what does that mean? What does it mean to persevere? Yeah, to press on, right? To continue, to keep going, right? And so, you know, these are not dark days, these are just stern days. We're serious, you know, these are serious days, but we're going to win, right? All we have to do is persevere. All we have to do is continue. And he says that too, right? Because he says, what are the British people like? Well, the British people they're tough and they're good at the last, right? He means that they're good in the end, right? So yeah, maybe they weren't quick to move from crisis to crisis. Maybe they weren't prepared. Maybe they were a little slow to kind of, you know, get into the mindset of war, right? Because they didn't really want to start a war. Maybe it took them a little while to get themselves organized, but we British people, we are good at the last. And once we make our mind up to get a job done, we get it done no matter how long it takes, right? And so, again, he's kind of giving advice to these young people, right? But he's also talking to the nation at the same time, right? Saying that we are going to win this. It might not be over tomorrow. It might not be over next month, but we're in a much better place than we were before. And all we have to do is persevere to conquer, right? And he says something else too. What does he mean when he says, these are not dark days, these are great days. The greatest days our country has ever lived, and we must all thank God that we have been allowed, each of us according to our stations, to play a part in making these days memorable in the history of our race. What's he kind of saying there? No, not yet. Even if we're not, what? Yeah, well, why are these the best days ever? Seems like they're not that great. They're making history.
Maybe because they managed to defend themselves against this great threat of the swords.
They did. They've managed to defend themselves. And think about it. Think about any hero, or let's say any Avengers hero. Can the hero be a hero if nothing bad happens? No, right? Then the hero's just sitting around watching TV, waiting for something to happen, right? So if nothing bad happens, the hero can't be a hero, right? And he's trying to say this, is that these are great days because we have the opportunity to be heroic, right? We have an opportunity to, you know, to do something memorable, to be heroic, to be great. And you can't do that when nothing bad is happening, right? When everything is just sailing along, you don't really need to be great, right? So he says this is an opportunity for us, and we should thank God for the opportunity to have the opportunity to make ourselves great. Inspiring stuff. Okay, we are out of time. I will see you all tomorrow. Have a good rest of Tuesday. Same with online people. See you tomorrow, okay?